The heat lay heavy over the canyon, pressing down on the convoy as if the sun itself meant to slow their progress. Harsh midday light bounced off the red dust cliffs on either side, throwing back a glare that narrowed vision and made the horizon waver under a curtain of heat haze. Second Lieutenant Kara Mitchell sat forward in her seat, eyes narrowed against the shimmer, scanning the bends ahead while the steady rumble of supply trucks rolled behind her Humvee. The radio at her elbow carried the clipped chatter of drivers checking spacing and engine temperature, a steady, familiar rhythm that kept the convoy linked. For a while, the connection held, the static only faint in the background. Then, as they reached the tightest part of the canyon floor, the voices began to break apart. Fragments of words came through, stretched thin by interference. A driver asked for a repeat. Kara leaned into the handset, but the hiss swallowed her response. The sound cut out entirely just as her driver glanced at her in question. She did not answer. Her eyes were already moving to the shadow lines on the cliffs. The first rocket-propelled grenade left a curling smoke trail across the upper rim, the shriek of its flight ending in a violent bloom of fire against the lead truck's side panel. The concussion rolled back through the narrow space, rattling armor plates and sending up a storm of red dust that clung to skin and gear. Heavy machine guns opened from concealed nests high on both walls, their rhythmic pounding scattering the convoy's formation. The air filled with the metallic sting of propellant mixed with the dry taste of grit and the sharper undercurrent of blood. Kara was out of the Humvee in seconds, boots crunching through shards of shattered safety glass as she dropped behind a wheel well, scanning for movement and counting the silhouettes of her people. Another RPG struck the rear vehicle, flipping it sideways and blocking the way back. A Humvee door slammed, and Private Lane stumbled into cover beside her, his helmet askew, his face pale under the dirt. Kara's voice cut through the chaos, low and sharp, ordering him to return fire on the left ridge while she moved. She broke from cover in a crouched sprint, weaving between the jagged shadows of the stalled trucks, one hand steadying the rifle slung across her chest. Bullets struck sparks from the engine block of the disabled lead vehicle, ricocheting in sharp metallic snaps. Corporal Davis was half sprawled on the ground near it, a dark stain spreading under the bandage he'd tied over his thigh. Kara dragged him into the shelter of the truck's underside, propping him against the tire before pressing the rifle back into his hands. He nodded once, jaw set, and shifted to cover her next move. Shouts cracked over the dying radio net, only pieces making it through call signs, urgent but incomplete, drowned in bursts of static. The once clear lifeline was now a broken thread, the green display flickering weakly as if the signal itself was gasping. Kara tore her eyes from it and scanned the ground ahead. A metal case lay overturned beside a crumpled soldier, its contents scattered into the dust-bundled documents, some marked with urgent red stamps. She swept them back into the case without looking at the labels, snapping the lid shut and shoving it under her arm. There would be time later to check what had nearly been lost. Now, the priority was to keep the living alive. She moved again, calling out firing angles, pointing survivors toward pockets of cover where the cliff face jutted just enough to shield them. Heat shimmered from the ground, blurring the edges of the battlefield so that enemies appeared and vanished in the blink of an eye. Through her rifle's scope, Kara caught glimpses of faces on the ridges, eyes narrowed in concentration, some burning with hatred, others lit with the cold detachment of routine. Each shot she directed was measured, aimed to push them back from their firing lines. Red dust swirled with every near miss, painting the air in shifting curtains that hid and revealed the shapes of men trying to kill them. The world narrowed to the stretch of canyon they could hold. Every glance at the cliffs reminded her how tightly they were boxed in, the walls not just a feature of the terrain but an unbroken seal on their escape. The sharp edge of shrapnel protruded from the dust near her knee, a twisted remnant of the first truck's side armor. It caught the sun, flashing once before she brushed past it, eyes fixed on the next burst of muzzle flash up high. Her orders came fast and clear, each one anchoring the survivors to the task rather than the fear. Lane moved when she told him to. Davis fired on her count, despite the blood soaking his trousers. The formation tightened. No longer a scattered set of targets, but a low, defiant arc, holding its ground. Somewhere above, another RPG tube clanged against rock as its operator reloaded. Kara's gaze tracked the sound, lips pressed into a thin line. She signaled with 2 fingers, and Turner, crouched near the ruined Humvee, swung the rifle toward the source. The next shot found its mark. A figure crumpled, rolling down the slope in a haze of red dust. The momentary lull was all they would get. Kara knew it, and she used it, pulling the arc inward and bracing them for the next wave. Leadership in the canyon was not about speeches or inspiration. It was about movement, control, and keeping panic from finding a foothold. As the gunfire rose again, she pressed the radio's transmit button out of habit, even knowing nothing would answer. The hiss came back at her, steady, empty, and strangely grounding. It was still there, even if it carried no voice, just as the canyon walls would still stand long after the fight had moved on. In the crushing first minutes of chaos, she had found the rhythm they needed to survive, and she would hold it until the last shot was fired. The air was thick with grit, every breath dragging red dust into mouths and throats until it mixed with the metallic tang of gunfire. Kara crouched low behind the twisted frame of a wrecked truck, scanning the gaps between its blackened panels. The survivors were spread in a rough arc. Each man or woman pressed into whatever cover the canyon wreckage could give. Bullets snapped past in flat, angry bursts, sending up small geysers of dirt where they struck. Above them, the sun blazed off rock faces, turning every movement into a fleeting glint that could be enemy scopes watching for a mistake. Kara could feel those eyes on them, brief flashes of reflected glass on the ridgeline, and each time her gut tightened with the knowledge that one pause too long in the open could end a life. She kept the arc tight, shifting people as she gauged angles and exposure. Corporal Davis leaned against a sandbag pile, his field dressing already soaked through, but his rifle was steady, eyes locked on a sector he refused to abandon. Turner was on his stomach near the center. The damaged radio opened beside him, tapping dials with the care of a man coaxing life from a dying thing. He muttered under his breath about interference. His words clipped, as if precision in his tone could force precision in the signal. Lane crouched beside the engine block of an overturned vehicle, glancing toward Kara as if waiting for the order he knew was coming. She gave it without hesitation, voice low but sharp, and he flinched before moving, ducking into a sprint toward the next piece of cover. The hesitation cost him seconds, and Kara's eyes tracked his progress until he slid behind a slab of concrete, rifle held awkwardly but ready. They could not hold the canyon forever. Ammo was dwindling. Each shot counted before it was fired. Kara's own magazines were light in her pouch, the absence of weight a constant reminder that their fight was measured in seconds and bullets. Between bursts of fire, she scanned the terrain and found their one chance a narrow drainage route, little more than a cut in the canyon wall, sloping down and out of sight. It was tight enough to limit enemy fire and twisted enough to give them cover if they moved fast and low. She folded her blood-stained field map back into her pocket. The mark she'd made over that route now burned into memory. There would be no second try. That path was their way out. Or it was nothing. She signaled Turner first, catching his eye and gesturing toward the gap. He nodded once, returning his attention to the jury-rigged radio. Wires hung loose from its side, taped in place, enough to give them brief bursts of position updates if they could reach anyone listening. Davis caught the signal next, his jaw tightening as he shifted his weight to be ready. Kara moved along the arc, touching shoulders, pointing to the route, giving quick, quiet instructions. She kept her body low, using the trucks, craters, and piles of debris as shields, her eyes constantly flicking upward for the flash of enemy movement. A fallen helmet lay half buried in the dust near one of the wrecks. She stepped over it without breaking pace, aware of the shape of it, the way it still faced toward the ridgeline as if its last wearer had died looking for the source of the fire. The canyon echoed with the irregular rhythm of battle moments of near silence broken by concentrated bursts from above. Each pause felt dangerous, as though the enemy were adjusting, learning their positions. Kara used those gaps to push them forward in short bounds. Lane went first, then Turner with the radio clutched to his chest, then Davis, grimacing with each step but never lowering his weapon. The glint from the ridgeline came again, a brief pinpoint of light between rock shadows, and Kara fired twice in its direction. The puffs of dust it stirred were the only answer, but it bought them another few seconds to move. She took her own turn at the dash, feeling the heat of the canyon floor through her boots. Every muscle braced against the expectation of impact. When she slid into cover beside the others, the air was full of the sound of their breathing, heavy and fast. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Trust in this place was silent, built on seeing orders followed and lives kept intact. Step by step, they edged toward the drainage cut. It loomed ahead, narrow and dark, promising escape but offering no certainty. Kara glanced back once, her eyes sweeping the line of survivors, and then forward again to the gap in the canyon wall. Adaptability was the only weapon they had left, and she meant to use it until they were out of range or out of time. The canyon bend ahead narrowed into a shallow S-curve, the rock overhead jutting just enough to cast uneven shadows across the floor. Kara's eyes caught the shape instantly. It was a blind turn, and with the overhanging shelf above it, she knew they could use the train to vanish and strike. The enemy patrol was still following, their movement steady, their confidence obvious in the way their fire came in bursts rather than desperate volleys. They believed they were driving her people into a corner. She signaled with a closed fist, slowing the pace until the team could slip into the lee of the rock. The survivors moved like ghosts, low to the ground, each footfall placed with care. Turner cradled the battered radio against his chest, Davis favoring his leg but steady, Lane keeping his eyes forward. Kara pulled the smoke grenade from her vest, her thumb brushing over the pin. They took positions without words. Davis set himself to cover the rear arc, Lane forward and low on the opposite side, Turner in a central point to shift fire where needed. The air was dry and still, only the occasional hiss of dislodged dust as someone adjusted their stance. Kara listened, counting heartbeats between the faint crunch of approaching boots. She could hear them now short, muted commands in a language she half understood, the scrape of metal on rock as weapons were readied. The metallic click of safeties disengaging came just before she yanked the grenade's pin, the small ring cool in her hand for an instant before she tossed the canister into the gap ahead. It hissed to life, rolling out a dense wall of white that spread and mixed with the ever-present red dust. The canyon became a thick, choking haze, turning sightlines into guesswork. That was the moment. Kara's voice cut sharp and low. Now, muzzle flashes cracked from their positions, coordinated and deliberate, not the frenzied spray of panic, but the tight rhythm of planned fire. Bullets found their marks through the smoke, each shot measured against the next. Brass clinked and bounced against stone, the sound quickening as the enemy tried to answer but found themselves pinned. Figures stumbled into view, shadows breaking the veil. Lane's first burst dropped one. Davis's controlled pairs forced another into cover. Through the shifting smoke, Kara caught sight of a man shouting orders rather than firing, his stance betraying command. She shifted, firing twice into the ground near his feet to force him off balance. He turned, eyes flashing with hate for a split second before recognition of her control. Of his disadvantage softened it into something else. She closed the distance in 3 quick steps, slamming him into the canyon wall, the rifle barrel pressing against his chest as she stripped the weapon from his hands. Sweat and grit streaked Abdul Rahim's face, his breathing harsh as Davis moved in to secure him. The fight around them was still live, but this was the pivot point. Rahim's field radio hung from his vest, the dial still glowing faintly, tuned to enemy chatter. Kara ripped it free, shoving it into her own gear, the sound of clipped, urgent voices spilling from the speaker. She didn't linger. "Move him," she ordered, and they pulled Rahim into cover as the last of the enemy fire sputtered out. Silence came in fragments, broken only by the hiss of smoke dispersing and the occasional clink of brass settling on stone. Turner stepped forward to check the path ahead, confirming the patrol was scattered, the survivors already retreating. Kara knelt for a moment, her hand brushing against a chipped dog tag half buried in the dust. She pocketed it without looking at the name, a silent marker for someone they couldn't save. The smoke grenade pin was still in her other hand, the small circle of metal warm now from her grip. She slipped it into her pocket as well, a reminder of the decision and the timing that had turned pursuit into capture. Rahim sat against the rock, bound and breathing hard, his gaze shifting from defiance to a wary calculation. His eyes no longer burned with the same certainty they had minutes before. Kara didn't speak to him yet. There would be time for that. For now. The team reformed, weapons up, watching both directions of the canyon. Initiative had bought them space. But it was only space. The next move would come soon enough. And when it did, she intended to be the one setting the terms. The convoy rolled through the low, dusty gates of the base with the weight of exhaustion hanging over every movement. The hum of generators filled the air, a steady undercurrent beneath the crunch of tires on gravel. Abdul Rahim was pulled from the back of the Humvee, under armed guard, his wrists bound, his expression unreadable in the orange haze of late afternoon. Kara walked a step behind him, the intel case from the canyon still tucked under her arm, its surface scored and dulled from dust. The base perimeter felt too small after the open violence of the canyon, the air heavy and closed in. They moved him quickly to a narrow building near the command tent. Inside, the heat thickened. The interrogation room was dim, the single fan overhead turning with a lazy rhythm that made the shadows slide across Rahim's face in slow waves. The air smelled faintly of oil and sweat, with an edge of paper dust from the files stacked in the corners. On the table between them sat an interrogation tape recorder, its cord frayed and wrapped in electrical tape. Beside it lay Rahim's confiscated ring, the dull gold, catching stray light from the fan's rotation. The military radio hissed softly, a constant presence in the cramped room, its static like the faint pulse of a heart. Kara sat forward, elbows resting on her knees, her eyes fixed on his. She began without preamble, pressing him to explain why his men had been positioned in the canyon, what they were waiting for. Rahim's gaze was steady at first, his voice slow and measured, clinging to defiance. He spoke of nothing specific, shifting to vague accusations and half-truths. Then, with a glance toward the door, his tone changed. Words came faster, edged with urgency. The canyon ambush, he said, was only the first step. The real objective was to strike during the movement of a U.S. general traveling under deep cover. At the same time, a separate team would seize advanced weapon systems from a forward depot. Both operations, he insisted, were coordinated to leave no time for response. Outside the narrow window, two officers stood in the corridor, their voices low. They leaned toward the glass only to exchange doubtful glances before looking away. Kara caught the movement in her peripheral vision but didn't break focus. She pressed Rahim for locations, numbers, confirmation of his chain of command. His answers came in fragments, some crisp, some crumbling under her questions, as though even he wasn't sure how much to reveal. The hiss of the radio filled the pauses, its thin, steady noise threading through their words. When she pushed the intel case further under the table, resting it against her leg, Rahim's eyes followed the movement. She read the flicker there, a recognition of what had been taken from the canyon. The fan groaned overhead, its blades pushing down hot air that carried the faint, metallic tang of the ring on the table. His gaze returned to her, softer now, but no less calculating. Kara asked again for specifics, but his urgency had ebbed into something like resignation. When the door opened, a senior officer stepped inside, his tone calm, but his words tight. They couldn't move on unverified information from a prisoner. The general's travel plans were classified at the highest level, and no adjustment would be made without confirmation from separate intelligence sources. Kara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had seen this before, the fragility of truth when it didn't fit neatly into the chain of command. Rahim leaned back, the fan's shadow slipping over his features, and for a moment the static from the radio was the only sound in the room. Kara stood, pushing her chair back slowly, the intel case still in her grip. The tape recorder sat between them, its frayed cord coiled like a question that would never be answered here. Information, she thought, was only as powerful as the will to act on it. Outside, the hum of the generators went on, steady and indifferent, as if the canyon and its warnings were already being forgotten. The operations tent was dim except for the low glow of desk lamps pooling light over paper and dust. Outside, the base carried on with its muted hum of generators and the faint clatter of gear being stowed. But in here the air felt still and pressed in. Maps covered the main table, pinned down by mugs, notebooks, and whatever weight could keep them from curling at the edges. Kara stood over them, the red grease pencil in her hand worn down to a stub, tracing lines that cut across the marked grid squares. Each line intersected with another, the shapes forming overlapping boxes that mirrored the kill zone where they had been trapped in the canyon. Turner sat to her left, the glow from his battered laptop reflecting in his eyes. The machine whined with the effort of processing, its screen showing columns of intercepted chatter paired with timestamps. He toggled between layers of data, overlaying the radio, traffic from Rahim's captured set against old recordings from past operations. A pattern emerged slowly, but it was there the jamming signal from the ambush matched bursts used in covert strikes years ago, down to the timing gaps between pulses. Turner's fingers stilled on the keyboard, and he glanced at Kara. She leaned in, eyes narrowing as she absorbed the match. The radio itself sat on her desk nearby, batteries removed, its casing scuffed and scarred. It seemed smaller without its power, but the weight of what it had carried lingered. She shifted her attention back to the maps, sliding one aside to reveal a faded aerial photo of the canyon, its walls stark in the overhead light. The same walls now appeared in miniature on the table, repeated in other zones marked by the grease pencil. Ambushes, real or planned, designed to force movement into pre-selected kill boxes. Turner pulled up a new feed showing satellite stills of crates being loaded at a forward depot. The angles weren't perfect, but they didn't have to be. Kara recognized the stenciled markings and the pallet shapes guidance systems, targeting modules, equipment that would take months to replace. The last image showed a flatbed truck moving under camouflage netting toward a rough airstrip. She slid a second map over, this one tracing the general's covert travel route. The airstrip sat less than 20 kilometers off it. The line of connection was impossible to ignore. Her jaw tightened as she marked coordinates in thick red, the pressure of the pencil so hard it left grooves in the paper. Every stroke was sharp and final. She knew what the official process would be: send the intel up, wait for verification, watch the hours slip away while the convoy and the general remained in motion. The chain of command would debate sources, weigh the risk of reacting to a prisoner's word. By the time they acted, if they acted at all, it could already be too late. The tense air carried faint bursts of radio chatter from other sectors, muffled and broken by distance. It felt like the world beyond their thin canvas walls was running on its own track, indifferent to the urgency building here. Kara stepped back from the table, rubbing the pencil's blunt end against her palm, leaving a faint smear of red dust. Her eyes moved over the pinned maps, the overlapping zones like a net tightening around someone who didn't yet know they were trapped. The canyon walls on the paper seemed to rise as she looked at them, a reminder of the place they had barely escaped and of the shape this threat would take again. She glanced at Turner, who was already looking at her as if he knew what she was thinking. The moral weight settled in between them without words. Acting outside protocol meant risk career, trust, even the safety of those she led. But acting inside it now meant accepting that the people on the ground would bear the cost of waiting. She capped the pencil, set it beside the map, and drew a slow breath. The truth was already here, visible in the lines and signals laid out before them. Whether anyone beyond this tent chose to see it was another matter entirely. The desert wind cut low across the ground, carrying fine dust that scratched against goggles and the edges of face coverings. Kara moved at the front, the red lens beam of her flashlight sweeping in tight arcs ahead of the team. The glow was dim enough to hide them from a distance, bright enough to keep boots from catching on the uneven ground. Turner kept close, the bulk of bolt cutters strapped to his pack knocking softly against his side, while Davis brought up the rear, his rifle angled toward the dark horizon. The staging area appeared in the gloom as a collection of corrugated metal walls and cargo stacks, their shadows shifting under the faint glint of starlight. They reached the perimeter without a word. 2 enemy guards moved along a slow patrol, their silhouettes breaking the straight lines of the walls. Kara signaled the split, her watch face catching a dim glow as she checked the time. The moment the guards passed behind a stack, the team slipped forward, boots silent on the packed earth. The first shots came quick and close, muzzle flashes searing the dark and briefly painting the walls in white light. The noise rolled outward, sharp and final, followed by the crack of another rifle from the far side of the yard. The air thickened with the acrid smell of burning as one of the crates splintered under stray fire and caught flame. Smoke rolled low, carrying embers in the wind, blurring sightlines and muffling movement. Kara's silhouette cut through the haze, rifle held steady as she pivoted to track the shifting edges of shadow between the containers. Turner reached the marked crate and dropped to one knee, the bolt cutters shaking slightly in his hands as he fought the lock. Davis covered him, firing in short bursts that kept the last few defenders from advancing. The lock gave with a snap, and Turner pulled the lid back to reveal the guidance system, even in the poor light. Kara recognized its shape. They wrapped it in canvas and strapped it to Turner's pack without ceremony. The fire spread along one wall of crates, its glow pulsing in time, with the muzzle flashes as they pulled back toward the gap in the perimeter. Near the exit, a discarded enemy radio crackled to life, spitting out a coded string in rapid bursts. Kara caught just enough to know the general's movement had been confirmed. She scooped it up, tucking it into her gear as they crossed back into the open desert. The red lens beam cut through the dust again, leading them away from the yard. Every step was measured, the urgency sharp but under control. The mission was done, the proof in their hands, and there was no turning back to ask permission. The abandoned checkpoint sat silent under a sky just beginning to pale, its concrete barriers half buried in drifting dust. Kara moved between them with quick, measured steps, her eyes scanning the choke points where the canyon narrowed. The team had taken position in silence, placing rifles where the elevation gave them a clean angle on the route ahead. Turner crouched near the far wall, his radio pressed to one ear, low static hissing through the quiet. The air felt too still, heavy, with the sense of something just beyond sight. Then the crunch of gravel reached them, tires rolling slow and deliberate toward the checkpoint. Kara lifted her rifle, the stock settling into her shoulder. 2 technical trucks emerged from the bend, sunlight catching on their mounted guns. She waited until the lead vehicle crossed the painted line worn into the asphalt, her hand raised in a silent count. When it dropped, the canyon erupted. Muzzle flashes lit the shadows, tracer fire arcing in green streaks that ricocheted light off the cliff faces. Turner's voice carried over the gunfire, calling ranges, his words snapping back in echoes from the walls. Davis worked the far flank, each shot precise, keeping the enemy pinned in the open. One truck tried to push through, its gunner spraying wildly into the defensive line. Kara's eyes caught movement behind it, the general, stepping from the rear of a nondescript vehicle, too exposed. Without breaking stride, she moved from cover, sprinting low until she slid on one knee across the dirt, her hand clamping onto his arm. She pulled him hard behind a barrier just as machine gun rounds tore through the space where he had been. Dust and chips of concrete stung her cheek, but her focus stayed forward. The truck stalled under the withering crossfire, engines growling as they tried to reverse out of the kill zone. Kara shifted her aim, emptying the last rounds of her magazine into the nearest gunner. The man fell back, and the weapon fell silent. Around her, the team's fire cut through the remaining resistance. Then, as quickly as it had started, the fight tapered off. Engines roared in retreat, leaving behind a smoking truck with its radio still alive, transmitting a faint, steady signal. The general clutched a dusty briefcase, his breathing uneven but his gaze fixed on her. She nodded once, already scanning the perimeter for the next threat. The canyon walls held the fading echoes of the firefight, each sound stretched and hollow in the cooling air. Her rifle hung light in her hands, the empty magazine a reminder of how narrow the margin had been. The relief that came was sharp-edged, edged with the knowledge they had only bought time. The convoy rolled back toward the base under the fading light, engines humming in a steady rhythm that blended with the faint hiss from the military radio on Kara's lap. The red dust of the canyon still clung to her boots and rifle, dry and powdery, leaving marks on the floor of the truck with every small shift of her feet. Soldiers sat along the bench seats in the back, their voices low, their eyes flicking toward her and away again. No one said much. The canyon walls were already far behind them, a jagged silhouette shrinking into the haze of distance. But she could still feel their presence, the way they had closed in around the fight. The base came into view as the last of the daylight thinned, the perimeter washed in a tired amber glow from security lights. The general stepped out first when they arrived, his dusty briefcase still in hand. He gave no sign of lingering, disappearing quickly into the cluster of escorting officers who moved him toward the command building without a glance back. Kara followed more slowly, the radio tucked under her arm now, the hiss still constant, as if it refused to be silenced. In the command tent, the air was warmer and carried the faint scent of coffee gone stale. A clerk placed a file folder on the desk with a muted thud, its label clean, the lines of the report neat. Kara glanced at it once, long enough to see that the summary called the checkpoint battle a failed harassment attempt. Her name was nowhere in it. The details that mattered the ambush reversed. The capture of Rahim, the recovery of the guidance system were absent. The envelope of intel she had carried back from the canyon sat on the edge of the desk, sealed and unremarkable, waiting for someone else to decide whether it meant anything. She stepped outside again, the sky deepening into a purple wash over the desert. The air was cooler now, but the dust was still in her hair and on her skin, clinging like the memory of the fight. The hum of the convoy engines still echoed faintly in her head, joining with the ever-present radio static. She folded her field map and slid it into her cargo pocket, the creases worn from use. The canyon might have been miles away now, but its walls stayed with her, a shape in the mind as much as in the land. They were a reminder of survival and of how close the line had been. No one here would say it outright, but the ones who had been there knew. Heroism would not be recorded, but it had left its mark all the same, carried quietly in the eyes of those who had made it back.